Clock now, so we will make a start. Thank you very much for everyone coming along to this Humanist Society Scotland webinar. I'm delighted that we are joined this evening by Professor Sir John Curtice. Sir John is a Senior Research Fellow at NACEN, Professor of Politics at Strathclyde University, and he's a Chief Commentator on the What UK Thinks EU and What Scotland Thinks websites. And as I mentioned before, many of you will know John from his analysis of politics on the TV, and of course through the period of the independence referendum as well. Now this evening, John's going to give us a short presentation about this question that we're having tonight: does religion still matter in politics? And then there'll be a wee bit of opportunity for Q&A. There is a Q&A section on your Zoom window. You'll see Q&A at the bottom. Please do type your questions in, and I will endeavour to get through as many as possible. Last time we held an online webinar, we didn't get through them all, but we will try and get through as many as possible tonight. So without further ado, I'll pass over to John, and away you go, John.
Thank you very much indeed. You need to set me co-host again, please. Excellent, thank you. So you see, this is always as you doubtless all of you who are familiar with Zoom will know, this is the moment when you get the slides coming up, and you get a little bit of toing and froing until we get it going. Anyway, we're now there. So thank you very much for the invitation to talk. I'm not going to pursue any great grand thesis in these opening remarks. Rather, really what I want to do is to kind of share some evidence on some of the topics that one might think be encompassed by the question, does religion still matter in politics? And here is really the 6 kind of topics that I'm going to look at. One is just to make sure we're all on the same page, is to look at the data on trends in religious identity practice. And apart from the last section, all of this is going to focus on Scotland, although very often for Scotland you can also see Britain. So first of all, one obvious question, first immediate question to ask about if religion still matters in politics, is to ask whether religion itself matters. And so therefore I'll take a look at the trends in religious identity and practice since Scottish Social Attitudes started as a separate survey just over 20 years ago. I'll then look very briefly at the link between religious practice and turnout, because one of the arguments that sometimes is made is that those people who turn up regularly to a religious service are more likely to be engaged in their wider community, and that therefore may be reflected in higher levels of political participation. I'll then move on to look at the question of party choice. Now, of course, historically in Scotland, there's long been a recognition that the Conservative Party was primarily associated with those who identified with a Protestant religion, while the Labour Party was more closely allied with those from a Catholic background. There was quite a literature in the 80s and 90s that said, well, but this is all beginning to disappear. I actually wrote a journal article with a graduate student of mine at the time, which questioned this and suggesting that there was still clearly a link between certainly Conservative and Labour and religious background. But of course, since then, Scotland's party system has been fundamentally changed by the way in which the SNP has become a dominant party. So we might wonder what that's done to it, as well as, of course, the fact that religious identity is now less common. Then come on to the constitutional question. Again, this has a history to it. Certainly, both support for the SNP and support for independence, if you go back to the 1970s, when there was the first breakthrough in national support and the first significant stirrings in terms of support for independence, was that the Catholic community at that stage tended to be fairly cautious about it. There were some in the Catholic community who felt that an independent Scotland might be Northern Ireland Mark II, i.e. dominated by Protestants and less advantageous to Catholics in Scotland than the Union. So, but where do we stand now in the very different political world we're at now, with support for independence running at around 50%? Then I'll turn to, in a sense, let's remember at the end of the day that most politics, and that's been, we particularly return to this theme at the moment with the particular agenda of the UK government. And most of our debates about politics are about inequality, the debate between left and right, between those who think that inequality is too high and the government should be doing something about it, versus those who think that the principal role of government is to set the incentives for entrepreneurs to take risks, and then out of which everybody will benefit, a more right of centre view. Well, is there any link between religious attitudes? And this, after all, quite a lot of religious teaching, particularly inside the Catholic Church, has been associated with a concern about poverty and inequality. So is that reflected in attitudes at all? And then I thought I would also focus in particular, and here I use British Society's data, at the moral issue where attitudes have changed most markedly in our society. That is, attitudes same-sex relationships. Back in the 1980s, particularly in the wake of the AIDS scare, most people inside the UK thought that same-sex relationships were either always or mostly wrong. We're now pretty much at the opposite end of the spectrum, with around 70% of people taking the opposite view. But on the other hand, certain religious communities are still reluctant to embrace same-sex relationships. So where do we stand so far as the broader religious attitudes are concerned? So that's broadly what I'm going to go through. I'll try and go through some of this fairly quickly, so we can then get into the Q&A. So first of all, trends in religious affiliation. So this is what you get when you ask people, what religion, if any, do you belong to? So actually, with the first advent of devolution, if you, in 1999, if you were to define a secular society as one where a majority of people do not regard themselves as having a religion, then actually it's really only about 10 years into devolution, only around 2010 or so, that we reached the point where, at least in response to the question that Scottish Societies were asked, that a majority of people say that they don't have a religion, and that now stands at around 2/3. One of the things I should say straight away about 2021, and once or twice I will say, caveat emptor, is that because of COVID, Scottish Societies could not be done in 2021 in the way that it usually was done, which is face-to-face knocking on people's doors. Some of it was done by phone, some of it was done through an online panel. So it raises some questions about the data. So you'll occasionally see me go caveat, which is one of the reasons why I'm also always going to show you 2019, which was done face-to-face like every other survey, as well as 2021. The religious community that by far and away has suffered decline is the church, as far as affiliation is concerned, the Church of Scotland. Much the same is true of the Church of England south of the border. Of course, the Church of Scotland, as it were, is the church of default. It's the church that many people would claim an adherence to, above all, without necessarily being very strongly practicing, but certainly, whereas around a third of people in Scotland were still claiming a Church of Scotland affiliation as recently as 20 years ago, it's now down to about 10%. In contrast, particularly if we kind of go like 2021, maybe not necessarily pretty accurate, the Roman Catholic Church, always very much a minority in Scotland, has pretty much managed to keep its end up. And hasn't perhaps been that much of a decline. And I'll show you other data in a moment, which is consistent with that. Equally also, I mean, other groups, other Christian, which of course ranges from everything from the Episcopalian Church, which is very similar to the Church of England, all the way through to some of the more charismatic and Pentecostalist movements, some of which have been growing. So you can see in aggregate, at least, these also have largely maintained their collective footing, at least in Scottish society. And meanwhile, of course, as Scotland's ethnic minority population, albeit much less than England's, has grown, so also has the non-Christian population. So the one Christian community, so the one religious community that has grown in size are those who belong to, Islam, Hindu, Buddhist, Jewish, whatever. And of course, those groups are even larger in England. So that's the one trend in the opposite direction to the increasingly secular direction, actually on both sides of the border. So far as attendance is concerned, well, here it was already the case 20 years ago that a majority of people in Scotland basically said, I never, not even for a wedding, baptism or funeral, darken the door of a religious institution. That's now running at around 3/4, although you'll note in more recent years the decline or the increase in people who don't attend at all has somewhat tailed off. But we're now roughly seen as something like a halving, and again 2021, slightly be more careful about it. We're seeing something of a halving of the proportion of people who attend some kind of religious service, mosque, Hindu temple, Christian church, chapel, whatever. It's now down to around 1 in 10 at most, probably a little bit below that. Undoubtedly, in part, this is a generational phenomenon. This is a position back in 1999. So back in 1999, only around a quarter of people aged 55 and over were saying that they didn't affiliate with a religion at all. The Church of Scotland's structure, on the other hand, very, very heavily demarcated by age. But again, other evidence here, the Catholic Church keeping its end up, indeed the other Christian churches, relatively weak relationship with age. Those patterns are still with us. It's just now that we are looking at patterns around a higher slope. So the Church of Scotland now has virtually got nobody under 35 turning up. Now perhaps signs of something of an age slope for the Catholic Church and other Christian churches. But then notice for the non-Christian groups, it's the other way around. It's younger people who are more likely to be in those groups. So again, further confirmation that here the trend is going in the opposite direction. And certainly Steve Bruce, who's the great sociologist of religion in Scotland, says that well, there are two big things going on. One is that parents who are religious are not necessarily transferring their religiosity to their children, and B, the rise of what we used to call mixed marriages, i.e. people of divergent faiths or denominations getting married. There's now more of that as well, particularly concerning Catholics. But again, that also potentially has implications in generational terms. Okay, and then equally also, I mean, when it comes to age and weekly attendance, again, you can see quite clearly that there is a relationship. And notice here that indeed, even amongst older people, whereas back in 1999, we were talking about a quarter of 55s and overs attending a church. Actually, now the age grading's got weaker because, as you can see, the attendance of older people has declined, and that is clearly, even allowing for people getting older. Almost undoubtedly, this isn't just simply a generational phenomenon. There's also just been some drop-off even amongst older people who once attended church. So anyway, with the exception of the non-Christian communities, very clear evidence of the secularization of Scotland. And to that extent, at least, religion doesn't matter because most people in Scotland don't attend a religious institution, and 2/3 of people in Scotland, or 3/4 even, regard themselves as not belonging to a religion. So to that extent, at least, I could stop the talk now and we could have an interesting conversation, but let's just pursue it a little bit further. I said at the beginning that there was some suggestion that, oh, sorry, this is just age and non-attendance, but again, this is just showing exactly the same kind of evidence. That people who attend church regularly perhaps are more likely to turn out and vote. At a simple bivariate level, that's certainly true, as you can see from example of Scottish elections. But of course, I've already shown you that there's a relation between age and religious attendance, and it's always been the case that younger people who are less likely to go to church have always long been less likely to turn out and vote. And actually, as you might note, if I can read the bottom of this slide, of course, it's quite difficult to disentangle the effect of age and religious attendance, given the very strong relationship between age and religious attendance. But doing it for the 55 pluses, where you can just about do it, well, there's still a little bit of a difference. It's 82% amongst weekly attenders and 79% amongst non-attenders. But probably most of this relationship is to do with the age differences in those who attend church and those who don't, rather than necessarily particularly the fact that people who attend a religious service are more likely to turn out and vote. But what about affiliation and vote choice? So here now I'm looking at religious identity or affiliation rather than religious practice. You can still see here, so if we go back to the beginning of devolution, the first Scottish parliamentary election, you can still see the traditional remnants of the religious divide in Scottish politics. Now, we have to remember the Conservative Party by 1999 is a relatively unpopular party, so therefore we shouldn't be surprised that even amongst Protestants, they're not that popular. But relatively speaking, they are still much more popular amongst Protestants, both Church of Scotland and other Christian denominations, than they are, A, amongst people who don't have a religion, and B, certainly Roman Catholics. And B, you can still see that 20 years ago, a very strong link between identifying as a Roman Catholic and voting for the Labour Party. Those things, and you'll still see, the SNP even now, even then, still somewhat weaker amongst Catholics than amongst Protestants, and certainly those of no religion. Though those differences are between Catholics and Protestants are much less than they once were. If we fast forward to 2011, when the SNP got an overall majority, well, as you can see now, the SNP dominant in all religious groups, and to that extent, at least, religion doesn't matter. But then you can still see amongst the remainder, the Labour Party has still got its link with the Roman Catholic community, albeit, no more popular than amongst the SNP, but relatively speaking, still strong. And that, relatively speaking, though only relatively speaking, Protestants are still somewhat more likely to vote Conservative than are Roman Catholics. So even in 2011, some of these remnants are still there. Again, still true in 2016. The link between the Labour Party and Catholicism is still there, and with the Conservative Party recovering to some degree, the link with Protestantism still remains. And indeed, the SNP is the strongest group, which is those of no religion. And then in the most recent election, here we've got a very strong support for the SNP amongst Roman Catholics. Not entirely sure about that, but certainly the relative strength of the Conservative Party amongst Protestants is still there. So even now, those old residues of the traditional religious divide in Scotland is still there, albeit between groups of people that, particularly as far as the Church of Scotland is concerned, are now much smaller in size than they once were. What about the constitutional question? Is there a difference of outlook there? Well, yes, to a degree, but it's now a somewhat different division from the one that you've seen on voting behaviour for the most part in most years. The two groups that have tended to be most in favour of independence are certainly one, those of no religion, but B, also Roman Catholics. Once started something in 2011, which was the year when the SNP picked up a lot of support from people who were not in favour of independence in that year, picked up a lot of people who were allied with the Church of Scotland. But again, as you can see, back to 2016, back to 2019, and even in 2021 as well, although there's a bit of a high level support amongst the non-Church of Scotland Protestants. Here, it's both Catholics and those of no religion who tend to be keener on independence. So whatever the concerns of Roman Catholics in the 1970s, they broadly disappeared. But Protestants' wish to remain inside the Union is still there. That then takes us on to the question of whether people actually, the relationship between religion and people's attitudes towards use of inequality. Now, this is a fairly rarefied way of getting at this, and so let me talk you through it a bit, because it's not immediately intuitively obvious. So what's behind these data is a suite of questions that are designed between them to get at people's perceptions of the level of inequality in society, and B, what the government should do about it. So they include questions like, do you agree or disagree that ordinary people don't get their fair share of the nation's wealth, or that there is one law for the rich and one law for the poor? And also includes the government should redistribute income from the better off to the less well off. And there are altogether, there's about 5 or 6 items of this ilk. And if you agree with these items, you're essentially expressing a left of centre point of view. If you disagree with these items, you are expressing a more right of centre view. And what we can do is we can give people a score so far as that answers these questions are concerned. So if you agree with all of these items, you're given a score of 1 on each of them. So then, given that there are 5 items, if we divide your total score by the number of items, you'll get a score of 1. Conversely, if you strongly disagree with all these items, then you'll get a score of 5 on all these items, which means you'll get an overall score, once we divide it by 5, of a score of 5. So just bear in mind, 1 means really left, really, really left wing. 5 means really, really right wing. Now, there aren't that many people in Scotland who are really, really right wing. I mean, you can see, for the most part, Scotland's getting a score, around the 2.5 mark, which means that given the midpoint is 3, Scotland is somewhat in the more centre-left direction. So also, by the way, is England. It's not particularly unique in that respect. The differences are not great, but they are there. The one to really note, and as I kind of hinted at earlier, people who are affiliated as Roman Catholics are rather more likely to express left of centre stroke concern about inequality than are other groups. Whereas in contrast, those of no religion, biggest group of course, are often relatively similar in their views to those of a Protestant persuasion, at least in most years. Although, here's a bit of a distinction. Those who belong to the Church of Scotland, 2021 accepted, have tended to be somewhat more left-wing than those of other Protestant denominations who have tended to be somewhat more, slightly more to the right than those who belong to the Church of Scotland. So there are some differences there, although they're not necessarily that enormous. But then let me just come more to moral issues, and I know there are other moral issues in which you'll be interested, which you may want to talk about in the Q&A. But as I said, let's focus on same-sex relationships, because this is the area where social attitudes have changed most dramatically over time. So again, bear in mind, this is looking at the position over time. And I'm now looking at this, and I think I've somewhat I've got this all the one way round. So invert the dates in your mind, because what I'm showing you here is the percentage of people who say that there's nothing wrong at all. Okay, and the first line is actually 2021, and the second line is 2015, and the third line is 2010, and the fourth line is 2005. I've kind of inverted them. And so the first thing to note is that 2005 is the year when civil partnerships came in, and actually it is as recently as then that on both sides of the border, the proportion of people who said that same-sex relationships are either never or very rarely wrong matched the proportion of people who said they're always or mostly wrong. It is only just over 15 years ago that we as society tilted from being plurality of us being inclined to be censorious about such relationships to a plurality being accepting stroke celebrating. All right, it's as recent as that. It's how dramatic a change it's been. And as you can see at that point, if you just take the bottom line and read it as 2005, at that point, even amongst those of no religious persuasion, only around a half were saying there's nothing wrong about this at all. And yes, those who belong to religious groups were less likely to express that view. By the time we get to 2015, by the time we get to 2015, the proportion of people of no religious background had gone up to 76. But by this stage, already, with the exception of those who don't belong to a non-Christian religion, we're already looking at majorities saying, of affiliates saying, yeah, okay, is accepting. And particularly for these religious groups, it's between 2010 and 2015 that there's quite a substantial movement, and the gap between them and those of no religion narrows. And as you can see now, again, the only group for whom this is still for at least a substantial, for a plurality, a substantial issue are those who belong to the non-Christian religions. That said, however, if we instead look at the data by religious practice, and this is just taking 2021, amongst those who attend a religious service once a week, it's still only 27% who say, no, there's nothing wrong with same-sex relationships, whereas it's 77% amongst those who don't attend a religious service at all. So there's a gap between those who are regular attendees and those who do not, and those who claim adherence but do not necessarily turn up regularly. In fact, once you move from weekly attendance to even fortnightly attendance, then you begin to get a very different outlook. But those who turn up weekly are still rather distinctive in their attitudes. So, in a sense, the simple answer is no to the question, but there are still some remnants of the traditional relationship between religion and vote choice. There's also still some remnants of the traditional division on the constitutional question. You can still see, and it's something that's been there for quite a while, Roman Catholics are rather more likely to be left wing. But when we come to moral issues, then religious attendance, at least, if not necessarily religious affiliation, is still a source of quite considerable division.
Thanks very much, John. That was fascinating. Thank you so much for taking us through that. Just again, a wee reminder, please do pop in a question into the Q&A function, and we can take any questions through that. I've got one question so far, but what I'll do, since we were on that topic, John, I had a question myself that was linked to same-sex marriage. I mean, when the Scottish Parliament passed legislation on equal marriage, I mean, that was a moment where Parliament overwhelmingly voted against the views of the religious groups, and obviously you're talking about the individual people within the views of individual, people who say they are religious, but the religious groups were still very much opposed to churches. Was that a moment where this kind of soft political power of the church was broken in terms of influencing parliamentarians, or was it the politicians were just aware that in the wider population, even religious people had kind of moved? Because that was 2014.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the big moment was 2005 rather than 2014. Okay. And that move, which of course was not done by the Scottish Parliament, it was done by the UK Parliament. The Scottish Parliament allowed the UK to do it for them because they thought it was a wee bit too controversial north of the border. As I said in my earlier remarks, that was very judiciously timed by the Blair government, because attitudes had already begun to, it's very, very difficult to remember. If you go back to the late 80s, 75% of people or so said same-sex relationships are always the mostly wrong, right? But public opinion was thereafter started to shift quite rapidly. And, we have all sorts of landmarks people now forget about, like, for example, the first lesbian kiss on Brookside and all the rest of it. So gradually, the public acknowledgements of same-sex relationships became more and more acceptable. And in 2005, the Blair, not in a sense, when, in a sense, the religious groups were taken on. They were taken on by the UK government, and because religious groups didn't think that weren't very keen on civil partnerships either, and were complaining about the creation of non-secular forms of marriage, right? But also equally, civil partnerships was also partly a compromise with the religious groups, because they saying, well, okay, we won't call it marriage, right? So it was a compromise in the sense of on both sides, but it was judiciously timed, because it was literally only at that point that the balance of opinion tilted in the direction, and then opinions shifted quite rapidly thereafter, because once the law had acknowledged legally same-sex relationships and provided a form of legal protection for them, that then helped to move public opinion yet further. So the law acknowledged a social change and then moved it much further. So sure, and then by 2014, well, there wasn't an awful lot of given in particular, it was a conservative prime minister south of the border that was also, again, these things happened in tandem, which kind of made, and particularly the fact it was a conservative prime minister that was doing it almost undoubtedly made it easier. Now, again, it was a bit of a compromise. So if the Church of England decides it wants to change its stance on equal marriage, it's going to have to get permission of Parliament, right? That was again part of the careful compromise. Yeah, the honest truth is, at that point, again, the compromise, well, it wasn't quite, although the registrars were required by law to do this, priests and ministers are not. So again, there's a bit of a compromise there. They can opt in if they wish to. So again, there's a bit of a compromise, but sure, given how relatively small the group of active adherents is, you can see why, as compared with the evidence of broader social attitudes and societal attitudes, which have now reached the point where if you express any kind of doubt about same-sex relationships, you can be decried as homophobic and all the rest of it. We've almost got to the other end of the spectrum now on this issue. And of course, also, if you were really tuned in, then of course, actually, the religious, even at an organized level, the religious community was not united. The Quakers were already in that position. Of course, the Scottish Episcopal Church has changed its position, like the American Episcopal Church, and the Church of Scotland is on a journey. The Methodist Church down south of the border is on a journey. The Church in Wales has now shifted. All right. So even organized religion now across the United Kingdom is gradually shifting on this issue, not least because you can see the attitudes of and particularly look at the attitudes of younger people, and you're going to go, well, look, you know, if you're going to get anybody, you know, you're going to have to change your position. So yes, I mean, yeah, it's a mark, but sure, I mean, I think by this stage, yeah, it was possible to take the churches on, if that's necessarily the case, on this issue, because frankly, the weight of opinion in the other direction was just going to be was so great that you'd be, and given the broader UK circumstances, it would be regarded as very, very peculiar. Scotland did do it when England and Wales were doing so under a Conservative administration.
I think that's a tour de force of that. No, yeah, absolutely. I'm going to move on to another topic very close to our hearts, as was the legislation on equal marriage, and very proud to be part of the organisation that marries the most same-sex relationships of a group, not as registrars, as you'll accept. But on assisted dying, and there's a couple of questioners have touched on this topic, so I'll try and just summarise that. But Kathy says, what do you feel about religion having an impact on politics? For example, churches campaigning against ideas like dignity and dying. I'll just ask the other one, since they're on the same topic, I'll just take them at the same time. And Jackie says, do you have any data on support for dignity and dying and proposed legislation?
Yeah, sure.
And then I had said about, and the questions I sent to you in advance about, you know, do you think there's any likelihood of a change this time round, given Margot's bill?
Okay. Let's take this. So, I mean, as the first question is, look, you know, whatever your views, you cannot deny the right of other organisations to argue against the change in the law, right? I mean, and you know, the honest truth is that I mean, British Social Writers in particular has covered this topic on more than one occasion, though unfortunately it's not done so more recently. But from what I've seen from other sources, I don't think it's very different. Broadly speaking, and again, obviously we can talk about, I think we're talking particularly about physician-assisted dying, right? Because obviously there's kind of some nuances here. If I were to characterize public opinion, I would say that there is, and has been for some time, majority of support for assisted dying in a limited set of circumstances. And that's essentially where somebody is terminally ill and is expected to die within a relatively short period of time. And if perhaps also, and you know, they just may also be in severe pain and don't think they could carry on. There is not, I think, majority support for assisted dying because somebody is paraplegic as a result of an accident or anything like that. There isn't majority support simply because somebody is in severe pain, or simply because somebody has had enough and wants to end their life. It is very much within that, and I you know, and it's not, oh, I've got a cancer diagnosis, I've been told I might die in 10 years. It's not that either. So there is, for the very limited range of circumstances where end of life is thought to be in sight, though of course sometimes, you know, one of the arguments is that sometimes people live much longer than was originally anticipated. So in that very limited, but arguably it's where the issue is at. In those circumstances, there has long been majority support amongst the public in general. I'm sorry, it's too long ago for me to tell you what people with different religious affiliations have thought, but I think we can probably anticipate that there will be less support for this position amongst those of a religious persuasion. I think my reading of what one has heard from a number of individual politicians, not least because of personal experiences that some of them have had of parents or other suffering rather uncomfortable deaths, despite perhaps the best of palliative care, right? And obviously there's still a lot of people who would feel even if you allow the option that palliative care is to be preferred if at all possible, right? That even that they have changed their mind. I think Baroness Davidson has expressed that view. I mean, Lord Forsyth has expressed that view. I think there are others who explain it, and that perhaps this time around it might go through. I think a lot will depend on the detail of the bill, the safeguards of the bill. Of course, what's also now true is that I forgot what it is. It's not. Is it the BMA? But one of the crucial religious organisations has now gone. Medical organisations gone to a neutral stance.
Yeah, the BMA. Yeah.
BMA, right? It's gone to a neutral stance. So again, also controversial. I think almost undoubtedly, as with unequal marriage, you would have to allow doctors to opt out, right? You might need to have, as is meant to be the case with abortion, 2 doctors certifying. So I think my advice to you would be, given my understanding of public opinion and of the concerns people will have, is that you go for a narrow bill. It's quite limited in the circumstances, and see how that works out. Because if that works out, then it may well be that public opinion will be willing to support something a little more liberal. Though I don't think, unless there is a substantial change in public opinion, they will want something that's a lot more liberal. You're really talking about, it's 6 months or so left, terrible pain, poor quality life. People have really had enough. And it's in those circumstances that you might find that a bill will go through. And obviously, there are a number of other countries where bills of different descriptions have gone through. So you can see the direction in which attitudes are going.
Absolutely. That's one of the striking conversations that we've been having with MSPs this time, is being able to kind of draw on that experience from other jurisdictions, because there's a lot more evidence than there was in the past. We were quite limited, and as you say, some of the jurisdictions overseas were much more encompassing, and so the fears about who could access it.
I think I think there will be a very substantial debate. There are some people. You'll know the argument. Some people feel that life is sacrosanct. There are others who do express concern about people being pressurized into, because obviously, even if it's only, I don't mean only in a pejorative, even if it is only 6 months, the care home costs, if indeed you're talking about somebody being looked after in a care home before they end up in a hospice or whatever, you can see the potential issues here that people will be looking for protection from. And even then, people will feel, well, people don't want to feel it. But these arguments are there, and to some degree, that it's a balance of risk between people feeling pressurized and people not being able to end their lives in circumstances they continue to find intolerable. And as is still the case, although now most people will say that abortion should be allowed, and should really be allowed, it's a woman's right to choose. Most people will still say, but it would be better if it didn't have to happen. Right? So that, to that extent, at least, I don't think many people are going to embrace it as something as a liberation, as opposed to learning to live with difficult circumstances in a way that perhaps might be regarded as more humane.
Problem. Yeah, no, that's understood. And working very closely with Liam's office, and we're hopeful, obviously, Liam MacArthur, who's taken the bill, and hopefully we'll get some success. And
it'll be interesting to see what comes out of the consultation and what some of the religious groups do actually say. I'm not sure they're all necessarily united on the subject.
Yes, the consultation responses have just been published a couple of weeks ago now, and the report makes very interesting reading, John. You probably quite enjoy it. But yes, not surprisingly, religious organisations opposed, medical groups mostly neutral.
Yeah,
a small
that's a
number,
big change. That's a
which
big
is a
change.
big change from last time. Yes, a big,
Yeah,
a
yeah,
big change, and I think that is based on, like I say, their experiences of their counterparts in other jurisdictions where, you know, it's not gone wrong.
right,
It's been
right,
relatively
right.
safe from their perspective. But yes, you're right in terms of conscientious objection for doctors. That will absolutely have to be looked at as it exists for the and under the Abortion Act as
Yeah,
well, of
sure.
course.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Kind of on the same theme here. There's a couple of questions. One from Sheena: how can we persuade politicians to stop paying so much attention to religious groups, given their low support across most of society? And Ian kind of says the same thing. How do we make MSPs aware that religious lobby is no longer commands the near majority of public opinion that maybe once did? So I don't know the answer. How do you convince politicians? There we go.
Well, you can only all you can do is to present them with evidence as to this. I mean, I'm almost going, what are the issues left? If we leave side, I mean, the only other issue I can see left is religious education in Scotland. Now that's one I don't think any politician I mean, apart from the Democrats who are willing to talk about it, and the Greens. You know, it's a bit like, you know, there's a good reason why the SNP won't take on the monarchy. Sure, they know that most supporters of independence would like to have a republic, okay, but it's a battle you don't necessarily need to fight, and you know, particularly because of course, in the case of Catholic education in particular, is what we're primarily talking about in Scotland, a lot of people who are not Catholics quite like it, particularly not those from minority groups. That's just that, and that's a kind of there you've got such a strong connection between the state and the institution. That's kind of much more difficult to unravel than is. You know, what is the moral code by which we're running by where religion would have a particular interest? So I suspect that's the one that will still be one where politics will just go, do I want to get into this? Do I really want to do this? Question mark. Particularly given also, actually, you know, as I've shown you, probably the Catholic Church in terms of adherence is not that much weaker. Well, it's not least of course, that's in part because of many of their kids go to Catholic education, and therefore they still pick up at least the affiliation. So, but otherwise, you know, I kind of throw the question back and say, well, what other are the moral issues of our time that I've not thought of, that where we've not already changed our attitudes, and changed the law that where it's going to be an issue of contention with religious communities? Question mark.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the obvious one we've already covered in terms of
yeah, it's just the time. I think at the moment, I can't. I'm not aware of any other one coming down the path.
Yeah. Well, the other one that we're obviously active.
I mean, because when we come to some of the other you know, issues that at the moment that as a society we talk about, where there's a great you know, there's a great lot of passion. So we kind of go into arguments about whether Britain should apologise for its colonial past and all the rest of it. Well, of course, in one sense, because the Anglican Church in particular, but also the Church of Scotland, has its diaspora, which is a conflict of empire. You know, that cultural connection exists. But equally, however, you know, when talking about social justice, you know, concern about, you know, the third world has long been a concern of many religious communities inside the UK. So I suspect they wouldn't necessarily be on a different side of the argument for yourselves on some of those issues, even if indeed you yourselves have a united position on this issue. Because I can quite well imagine it might divide humanists as to whether you think we should be knocking down statues or not.
I think there is absolutely diversity, as much as there'll be diversity of views within religious groups as well. I'm sure. I think you're right. It's not a topic that divides people, and their religion belief from my experience. And we have people on both sides. But yeah, you've already touched on the two topics: it's assisted dying and it's education. The one area, the big piece of research that we funded years ago by academics at Glasgow University about the role of religion in law, and where in Scots law where religion is mentioned or given particular influence.
Yes, indeed.
Yes, it's schools and education was the one area where it had increased over the kind of second half of the 20th century, and everything else it declined massively. So it's definitely.
Yeah, it depends a bit on how you ask the question. I can find you surveys that have a majority of people who are against religious education. But
and areas obviously we are focusing on are I think that there should be easier to win arguments like religious worship during the school day and allowing young people to opt out because they still don't have the right, obviously, to opt themselves out. The seats on the education committee.
It still requires the parents to
opt out. So we're pushing on that, and we're pushing on.
How many schools follow the law on religious worship anyway?
Quite a few actually. I mean, it's not as mandatory as it once was, and you'll find practice a lot more strict in primary schools than you will in secondary schools.
Right.
And actually, in a lot of places, it's because it's easier for the head teacher to say to the minister or the chaplain, school chaplain, come in and fill in this half-hour slot, and it's something else. And I don't mean this in a pejorative way, but for a lot of head teachers, it's something off of their plate. They've done that part because they have to, in terms of an inspection, they have to show that they've done this spiritual development of children, as the curriculum talks about. So that's what we're focusing on. And the other thing we're focusing on at the moment as well is the reps that sit on the education and the local council education committees, which there's one Church of Scotland, one Roman Catholic, and one other rep. So they seem like the easier issues to convince politicians. We're not talking about the denominational schools, because I think obviously our position would be we wouldn't have denominational schools, but you're right to point out that trying to convince any major political party to open that as a point of discussion is pretty much a non-starter.
I think perhaps particularly because the Catholic Church is in much better health than the Church of Scotland.
Yes,
so you're taking a much better entrenched institution.
Absolutely. So move on to a different topic. Jennifer asks about the politics of sectarianism, and if you've looked at any research around sectarianism or attitudes to sectarianism.
Religion we did a long time ago. Yes, go on.
And the religion could be less to do with belief and possibly more to do with tribal differences like football or orange box, things like that. Is there any research on that, and what can be done to?
There is. I'm sorry, it's quite a while ago, and it's a long. I'm going to struggle to remember most of what it says. So I will tell you that there is a report on the subject somewhere buried on the Scottish Government website, because we did do it for them. The one thing I remember about all of that is that in that year, when we asked a lot of questions about sectarianism, is the proportion of people who claimed religious identification was noticeably higher. So in other words, if you start asking people about religion, you begin to stir the almost died embers of their religious sympathies, and they become more likely when you come to that standard question. That much I do remember. Otherwise, I think I'm just going to say, read the report or ask me to come back and talk another time more specifically about this, because it's too long ago for me to remember, what exactly we come up with. But certainly, sure. I mean, in general, yes. A lot of sectarianism, well, I mean, 2 points. I mean, the Scotland of the Rangers and Celtic football matches and of the Orange and Hibernian marches, for the most part, is a million miles away from where most people in Scotland are at. And true, yes, I know. I mean, if it's to do with anything, it's as much to do with issues of Ireland and the Union as it is to do with issues of religion. And yes, it's much more to do with religious if it's to do with religious identity, etc., and the traditional stances to do with that, and just do anything else. But I think beyond that, I'm not going to say anymore.
Yeah. So moving a wee bit more on to like kind of personal about the politicians themselves. Chris has asked about, can you speak about the social utility of religion from the point of view of a politician, even if he or she doesn't believe in the religion themselves? So I don't know if that's or just about the positioning of themselves within a religious viewpoint. And there was one that was on a similar kind of let me see if I can find it again. About Jim had said about, do politicians tend to pander to those with their own religious supporters, or do they deliberately try to woo those who are not natural supporters? For example, would a Catholic politician try to be particularly interested in Protestants and their own religious? I suppose the answer to that is it depends on the politician, doesn't it?
Well, apart from certain parts of Western Scotland, if you're standing as a Catholic politician, you're not going to stand as a Catholic politician anymore. You're going to stand as a Labour politician or an SNP politician. It's not strong enough. It is obviously clear. I've shown you. I think disproportionately. It's a while since I checked this. I think it's still true that Conservative MPs are more likely to be, if they have any religious affiliation, they're more likely to be a Protestant one. And I've already shown you that, but equally, there's no way the Conservative Party is going to survive on the back of Protestant votes alone. There just aren't enough votes in it for this. The more interesting question, I think, which I saw in one or two of the other questions, is about how politicians do or don't decide to play this. And I think, they vary. Some politicians of a religious persuasion tend to keep quiet about it. Others not. Theresa May was just open about the fact that she's a weekly attending Anglican, right? Kate Forbes is open about the fact that she's a pretty fundamentalist Protestant, John Mason is also clearly at the fundamentalist end. But then, to what extent does it reflect their politics or not? Some politicians of religious persuasion don't necessarily follow the views of their religious community. I don't think Theresa May has expressed any opposition to equal marriage for quite some time. John Mason, on the other hand, clearly his views are affected by his fundamentalist background. Well, surprise, surprise. But there are not that many politicians who are, very, very strongly parading their religious background anymore. The one thing that matters, I've chaired a number of these. Where religion and politics, religious groups and politics kick in these days, certainly in the West End of Glasgow where I live, is providing, but then this is a long-standing function of churches, is to provide a neutral forum for hustings for politicians.
Yes.
Right. I can remember that as a student in Oxford, and one church or other would provide a neutral hustings to get all the politicians together, and certainly it happens in the West End of Glasgow on numerous occasions. And I've often had a great chance of privilege. It's great chairing. It's great fun. You can just nail all the politicians one by one. But obviously, that therefore politicians are not necessarily going to. Well, depending. If you're Patrick Harvey, you're not going to. Well, even Patrick Harvey will turn up to religiously organised hustings, right? But no politician is necessarily going to, say, I don't believe in your lot or whatever. And if they're invited to talk or whatever, for the most part, they're going to do it. More or less like any group. So I think to that extent, at least, insofar as churches bring certain groups together and they therefore provide a forum of people to whom they can talk, most politicians will take the opportunity. but it'll be true if you invite them as well,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Or any other group of civil society looks reasonably responsible and might provide a fair hearing. Yeah, I mean, progress groups doubtless invite politicians to turn up. Schools invite politicians of all. So there's always that interaction between civil society and politicians, and obviously that's also a way in which politicians keep in contact with society, because they then hear views expressed that they don't necessarily otherwise hear.
Bob's asked an interesting question, just going back to some of the data that you got in your slides about the shifting views between right and left using economic issues, and the attitudes towards same-sex relationships. Do you have any thoughts about other kind of issues, and then is that link so clear about like environment, about attitudes towards migrants, attitudes towards nuclear weapons, for example? Is there a clear link to religion through those?
What good questions. Some of which I know I could answer, but I think the attitudes towards migrants will be relatively sympathetic. Okay. Again, it's of a par with some of the ways in which these communities. But again, if you send me one or two of these questions, I can find some data on it to check that out. And I think it will also be true. Is it? I don't think religious communities. I mean, as a society now, we're opposed to the death penalty, and I don't think religious groups are, at least collectively, are particularly distinctive on that anymore. But again, that's something I could check out. I know where the data are, but it's a long while since I've looked at it.
John's also asked about what evidence is there of the different reasons for a decline in religious affiliation. Is there any further background? Obviously, the data you're showing is this massive decline, but is there any kind of reason? I mean, you touched on obviously people not bringing up their children in a particular faith has an impact, but is there anything else that you know from studies?
Again, I'll recommend you read Steve Bruce stuff, which is going to be much more detailed. But certainly, one influence is education in a couple of ways. One is education tends to imbue more liberal social values, which we've all agreed are less likely to find in these communities. It also tends to generate social and therefore geographical mobility, and therefore helps to divorce the next generation from the geographical environment in which they might have been socialized into a religion. It's also, I think, to do with, frankly, a variety of other things that people can do with their time. Right? I mean, religion used to provide an important communal focus. It's a way in which people could get together. And an era when, no television, or eventually limited television, and at the time still when television wasn't allowed to broadcast, when, no Sunday morning television or any of that stuff, right? So much more in the way of alternative leisure facilities, and that has also helped to erode religion. So all of these things have gone on, and perhaps also increasing affluence doesn't help either. So it's broadly speaking the social changes that you can think of, which have had this effect of gradually resulting in lower religious adherence. And I guess there is also, for some people, will be the challenge of scientific discovery. Once upon a time we thought there were 9 planets going around a sun. We now go, there are loads and loads of suns and more planets than we ever know what to do with. And for some people, debates about Big Bang and dark matter and all the rest of it are a challenge to religious belief. Now, for others, it's not. For others, they will say, look, religion is always just told a narrative of explanation, and that is the core essence of religious messaging is not necessarily affected by this. But, all of that, obviously, for some people, presents something of a cognitive challenge. So all of these things are going on.
I mean, it's definitely, if you look at some of the studies of people who call themselves humanists. I mean, Carl Sagan's got a lot to answer for converting lots of people to kind of humanism or non-religion, and his TV program, The Pale Blue Dot, and all that kind of stuff definitely changed a lot of minds. Sure. Obviously a number of years ago now, but there's a lot of literature actually on the influence of that kind of science on TV, and that influence that it had on people's religious belief, which is quite interesting. Just a couple more questions then, and I think that'll be us towards the end of this evening. So again, just linking back to the data sets you were looking at, is there any other data that would link to religious attendance? So Nelson's asking about, is there a link between affiliation and weekly attendance and SIMD, for example? And to the same extent, David's asking...
Sorry, SMID as in?
Multiple deprivation, Scottish Institute of Index of Multiple Deprivation. And
it's middle-class people. It's middle-class people. Well, certainly it'll be middle-class people who are more likely to go to Protestant services. The Catholic Church will be somewhat more varied in its demography.
Okay, that gets to the heart of it. And
of course, the non-Christian religions are dominated by the ethnic minorities. I mean, it's the growth of ethnic minorities that's driving the increase in non-Christian, which of course is why now London, despite being incredibly liberal part of the country, also is one of the areas which is seeing a growth in religious adherence because of the very large ethnic minority population.
No problem. I think that brings us, unless there's anything else that you want to
No, you've pretty much drained my knowledge. Yeah, I mean, if you want to send me one or two of these questions that I could have going, well, yes, I know where the data is, but it's a while since I've looked at it. By all means, do, and I can send you a brief note. But hopefully,
no problem. Well,
thanks. At least of the broad terrain.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for joining us this evening, John, and thank you for everyone for tuning in. There are a couple of other events coming up. The Humanist Society are running online. If you'd like to take part, we have our time travel game, which again is another online event tomorrow night, actually at 7 o'clock. It's one thing to say another world is possible, it's another to experience it, however momentarily. So there's a link to that in the chat function. And then at the end of the month, our regular book group that meets online will be discussing an AC Grayling book, The Meaning of Things, and they meet quarterly. And again, the information about that's on our website, humanism.scot/events. But just the last thing is just to say again, a huge thank you to John for his enlightening presentation. I hope everyone enjoyed it. And we have recorded it so we can share it with all our other members as well. But thank you for joining me, and I'll see you all again soon. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Fraser. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.